Hello, Stat Pack, and welcome back to Of Significance, the podcast that's neither null nor dull, not casual about causality, and we've always got time for series. I'm your everyman host, Brent Buckwright here, just trying to keep up with two experts who could never be replaced. It's Doctors Nathan Woods and Steve Bronars. How are you two?
I'm doing great. How are you, Brent?
I'm also doing great, Brent.
I'm doing great. If you've been paying attention to X, formerly Twitter, there was a fight that broke out in January regarding H-1B visas and their place in the American economy. Top Trump officials and donors like Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy are highly in favor of these programs, citing the need for these types of workers, whereas the Republican voting base is opposed, citing concerns about increased competition from foreign workers. Putting politics aside, we thought it would be great to talk to someone who actually knows a thing or two about H-1B visas. He's testified multiple times to Congress on the matter and can even spell the program without looking it up. Steve, it's you. I've already introduced you. My first question for you, Steve, is I think a lot of people have talked about H-1B visas. We have a vague idea of what a visa is, but I don't think most people know any of the details about how they work. So suppose I'm an employer. How do I actually get an H-1B visa for a worker?
Okay, here's where I want to say I'm not an immigration attorney, but there's going to be paperwork that would be filed with U.S. Customs and Immigration. I think it's called a Form I-129 that would authorize a person to continue their stay in the U.S. if they're already here, or to be able to work here if they're currently overseas. That's one part. And then the other part determines how much they're going to get paid, and that's paperwork that would be filed with the Department of Labor. It's called an LCA, and it's part of what would be a prevailing wage determination specific to the job that you'd be bringing the person in to work at.
So I need to fill out some paperwork. I've got a position I need to fill, and I guess just as a size of magnitude, how many positions are we talking about here? What is the size of the market, the labor market that people are trying to fill jobs for?
Right. And so for this particular program, H-1B, it has largely become for tech workers, STEM workers. And so there are going to be 85,000 slots per year that are going to be available. But the interest in bringing in people under an H-1B visa is much greater than that. So there could be hundreds of thousands of applications that I talked about for these prevailing wage determinations, because not everybody's going to win. There's a lottery. You could get the ability to have an H-1B visa or not. And so...
Yeah, so for fiscal year 2025, it was something like 480,000 applications, and then there's always 85,000 spots that can be filled. Which seems like it's not a huge number of jobs that are entering the market in the first place.
Right. Like I said, it's recently been much more of STEM jobs. And I think the Department of Labor, Bureau of Labor Statistics would say there are probably about like 12 million STEM jobs in the U.S. If you look at college graduates, 800,000 people are coming out each year with STEM degrees. So the 85,000... it's not a trivial number, but it's not huge relative to the size of the market, and they would be here for a few years under that visa. So it makes a difference, especially in these industries that are looking for tech workers, but it's not as influential as maybe some other visa programs are on the size of the workforce.
You mentioned that there's some procedure for calculating a prevailing wage. What is that?
Well, you're certifying that you were looking for the worker. This is the best worker for the job. You couldn't hire a U.S. worker to do this work. And so there are really 4 different levels at which the Department of Labor would put the candidate in, and depending also on the position that they were working in. It's depending on their education and experience, level 1 through 4. And then they rely on wage survey data throughout the U.S. to pinpoint what they think those 4 wages would be, in a particular city and occupation. So the number one occupation that people are coming in for these visas, into at least a request, these 480,000 requests, would be software developer, which clearly is a STEM field. And the number one area that people are coming into, not surprisingly, is Silicon Valley, the San Jose metro area. And the wage that the DOL will tell you is that effectively becomes the minimum wage that you would, your minimum salary, really. You would pay these workers. Depends on whether they're level 1 through 4, depends on the city. So San Jose would be different than Seattle, then would be different than Washington, D.C. And then the occupation. Software developers have a different rate of pay than management consultants or any other occupation. And so you really don't get to choose the prevailing wage determination. That's told you by the Department of Labor.
So, Steve, I mean, the prevailing wage, so that's specific to the labor market and the job. And so, at least theoretically, that means what, hundreds of different paid benchmarks all across the country, unique to a particular location and the type of job, right?
Yeah, there are basically 400 metro areas in the U.S., and there are 800 different detailed occupations, which would make like hundreds of thousands. But for all intents and purposes, there are about 20 or 30 occupations that really dominate the space for the H-1B. So it's thousands of specific wages that the DOL puts out there in their wage library.
So at this point, then you've got a determination of the salary that would need to be paid, the minimum salary that would need to be paid based on whichever of these 4 levels.
Right. So to give you an example, the software developer in San Jose, which is the most common request, the level 1 pay, which is determined by the pay survey in San Jose for software developers, is $146,000. You cannot bring in somebody, no matter how inexperienced, and pay them less than an annual salary of $146,000. And then level 2 is higher than that, level 3 and level 4. If they have more education and experience, it's tailored to that specific area and job.
It's so those are quite high numbers, and obviously some jobs in different geographic locations, the levels are not going to be quite so high. But that kind of begs the question for me anyway, which is if the kind of minimum level for a job like that is going to be $146,000, isn't one of the concerns about the H-1B program that it would somehow drive down wages of non-program participants, native U.S. applicants?
Yeah, I think the whole rationale in the laws that led to this program and other programs are to protect the interests of workers who are already here in 2 ways. One, by limiting the number of entrants each year, and the other is by saying, even if someone in another country in Asia or Latin America would be willing to come in and work for half of the 146,000, you're not allowed to do that if they're going to be working as a software developer. So the point of this program is to protect the workers who are most directly competing for those jobs. Question is, how effective that is, but that is the design of having both a cap on the number of visas and this prevailing wage determination. And I think that one of the questions is, how accurately do we know what the specific wage is for a specific skill level of workers in each of these cities, right? Because that can vary a lot. The level 1 wage in San Jose is going to be way different than it would be in Washington, D.C. for a software developer, or Chicago, or even smaller cities like Des Moines, Iowa. And all of them could be applying, businesses in all those areas could be applying for them. And they're going to be, each one of them is going to have a different minimum salary that they would bring a software developer in for.
Am I able as a business to set up a visa request for my branch in DC, get that person at that pay, and then move them to California and keep them at the lower pay? Or does it transfer wherever you go?
There have been allegations of that kind of thing. I mean, there's one of the things that's really interesting about this, Brent, is you and I were talking over the holidays, is like how this has become in the news such a big thing, or on X such a big thing. One of the things that's true is that it's very transparent from the data on the DOL website which companies are requesting visas at what location and what that prevailing wage determination would be for that position. But I think you're right that that's possible, that there could be internal movements, and if the company's not really being completely honest, um, I guess it's possible that they could bring someone into the lower wage city and then transfer them to the higher wage city. That would be an abuse of the program. I don't think that's allowed, but that doesn't say that it doesn't ever happen.
Yeah, this is I guess, a theoretical loophole that someone could exploit. Another argument I've heard is that if I'm an employer, I could put up multiple jobs to try and get one employee to fill any of those positions, but they're all relatively similar in description. So I could try and get 10 visas, and basically it's entering myself into the lottery more. Is there anything we know about companies' ability to game the system in that way, or is this all very speculative?
There are a lot of people that have written about this, and the Biden administration tried to crack down on this and saying, look, you cannot, I mean, it's like buying 10 lottery tickets rather than one. Maybe one of them will win for the same person. And I don't think that was the intention of the program. And there was a move to try to not allow companies to do that, with multiple positions at, possibly different locations for the same person. But these are large companies. They have a large presence in the U.S. They generally rely on the program. They do it repeated year after year. They have presences overseas. Like I said, some of the people that they're going to be recruiting are coming out of U.S. schools, some overseas. So, yeah, I think that any of these things is possible, but I don't know that how often these kind of things happen. But I know that both of these issues have raised some concerns for critics of this program.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit odd to me that this is even a major topic of conversation, because 85,000 is not a small number, but as we always talk about here, small compared to what? It's silly, I think, to have as much talk about this, given that 85,000 is a rounding error when coming to looking at the unemployment rate in the United States. Like, this is just such a small number to make a big deal about for a program that seems very popular. It seems like we're trying to fill a lot of these positions.
Well, yeah, and I guess just to take that another step further, so it's 85,000. There is a minimum mandated salary, that you've got to pay. You can't pay them whatever you want. I guess I don't exactly see what the evidence might be out there for how it's going to harm, a U.S. employee, a U.S. applicant. So what is that evidence, if there is any?
Well, I think that some of the discussion relates to, I think it's a little bit related to the point you raised, Brent, which is once you're here on a visa like that, you may not have the same kind of bargaining power as a U.S. worker who's just free to go somewhere else. If you're terminated from your job, you have like 60 days to find another one under the H-1B visa, or you have to leave the country. So there are people that have criticized it for that. But I think that the intention of this was to protect the workers who are most directly competing for these jobs. But there are other co-workers in the same place that say, hey, we're having a hard time. We do something else other than develop software, but we need software developers. And bringing in more workers who can do that, even if they're coming from overseas or they would go back to their home country, but for this program, could have some positive spillovers, because you need coworkers who can do some of these tasks that you're unable to find the workers domestically who are doing this. I think the reason why it's viewed a little bit different than some of the other visa programs is because these are really good jobs, generally speaking. I mean, I pointed out like some of the highest paid jobs, but we're talking about jobs that are generally paying six figures, right? So I think the view is like, boy, wouldn't it be great if more U.S. workers coming out of school could get these jobs, and we didn't have to rely as much on workers coming in through the visa program. But that's easier said than done.
But I think that if you look at the unemployment rates in the majority of STEM fields, you're going to see that the unemployment rate is lower than the unemployment rate in the market as a whole. That we need, there's jobs that need to be filled, and that as a part of the program, you have to make an effort to try and fill those jobs with American workers first. So it seems like there's a lot of effort to make sure that those jobs are going to Americans.
Is there research that has shown one way or the other that this is, terrible for native born potential employees, or so amazing for businesses that it offsets whatever the bad news might be? Like, has somebody studied this effectively, comprehensively?
Well, I mean, it's always a difficult problem because you're trying to say what would have happened but for these programs. But I think the general premise is as more workers are allowed to enter the U.S., you would expect it to be an increase in supply that would have a moderating effect on pay. I think the real question is, if that didn't happen, would we be outsourcing that work to these STEM workers, these tech workers in other countries? And I don't. It really depends on what the assumptions are about that other benchmark. But I don't think you would want to say that it has zero effect, because that's the whole point. Is like, hey, we can do this work here, and I think you brought it up, Brent, when you said the unemployment rates are really low. The employment rates are really high for workers in these fields. It's all supply and demand.
I want to make 2 points, I think. One is very small and dovetails off this, which is in an economics model, isn't any increase in workers going to suppress the wages? Isn't that definitionally the case? Like, this is just a movement of your supply curve that's the all else equal. And then the reality of
Elon Musk says, grow the pie.
right. So the reality of economic life is that it is not all else equal, and that you're going to have a demand shift as well because you've increased the number of people to demand things. But that there's nothing special about the H-1B visa program that says because we're adding workers, in this case, workers' wages are suppressed. If you added any number of extra people,
Exactly.
that pressure would exist.
Yeah. There's been a big increase in the number of people going into STEM fields, right? It's now, used to be like 30% of college degrees were in STEM fields. It's now 40%. That has driven down the pay of workers in STEM fields relative to what would have happened had there not been more entry. So it's always supply and demand. Anything that's going to increase the supply of workers would have this kind of modest impact. But there's already these price controls that when you bring in the workers under this H-1B program, they have to be worth the cost. You're set up with these minimum salaries that you have to pay. So like we were talking about with San Jose, it's going to have to be a pretty talented worker, even at the entry level, that would warrant $146,000 per year salary.
So one other consideration that I think is interesting to discuss in the context of these H-1B visas is human capital, because our government spends a bunch of money at the beginning of people's lives and at the end of people's lives as part of our social support networks. And the best value we can get is by bringing in someone who's already trained to just start being productive. So as far as bang for your buck for the economy, is there any reason to expect that these foreign workers are going to be just net positive for us, or is that a misread of the kind of social calculus involved?
The cost of coming up with the next generation of tech workers, STEM workers, is in part the educational process and the training process. And the funny thing about the H-1B program is that a bunch of the workers that are coming in on that program, they're already here on student visas. So is the same cost, you could argue whether the worker was born in another country or born here. If we're bringing in workers that were trained in another country, it's like that's a kind of an advantage to us because all of the costs of training were already borne, and we're reaping the benefits from that to some extent as a society. So I do think it's an issue here. I think the other thing is that there's been growth in these areas where the STEM related fields, which extends to healthcare and other things, not just tech. And there's a limit to how quickly we can increase the supply of workers in this area if we don't rely at all on workers that are from other countries. So it allows us to respond, I think, more quickly and efficiently. Maybe if we have a good plan for, education and training 10 or 20 years from now, we'll be able to increase the number of workers in these fields, but it takes time. And bringing in workers that already have these skills that are in other countries is a way to achieve that goal much more quickly.
And that's going to be true as long as the people are doing that work here in the U.S., right? So there's at least some possibility that the people who don't like this program as much are saying that companies that operate offshore bring people in, get them trained up, and then move them back to a different country to do that long-term work at presumably a much lower rate. So we wouldn't be getting the longer-term benefit in that scenario.
Yeah, I think we'd be getting less. It depends who is purchasing the products that they're using, the services that you're using. Anytime the service and the product could be provided at lower cost, it does have some benefit to customers here.
Steve, I know we're getting to the end here, but when you were there testifying in Congress about this stuff, how many of them were present and were they paying any attention?
Nobody was paying attention. And there weren't that many there at the same time in the Senate subcommittee.
So in that regard, it was different from teaching because at least the students were there.
Yeah, that's true. More of the students were there. Not sure if they were paying any more attention.
But they're all paying attention now. That's been this episode of Significance. This episode's been brought to you by Edgeworth Economics, a leader in economic consulting, and with the help of our producers Kimberly Krewald, Ryan Deal, and Brian McLamara of Brand Ready Media, with special help from Elliot Delahaye and music by Armwell Lang. Thanks for listening, StatPack, and as always, remember to double-check your assumptions.